Hello everybody and welcome to episode 1 of Exported History. Today we will be talking about Corfe Castle, situated in Dorset. Created as a symbol of power, control and prestige, Corfe Castle is a striking example of an enclosed motte and bailey. It has stood in its former ashlar and now ruined form for over 1,000 years. It is situated upon a double water gap and tasked with the protection of trade between Purbeck and Wareham. Medieval castles by definition have been responsible for the administration of local residential and defensible affairs within their assigned lands. However, they sometimes transcend these roles due to their symbolic nature. Fortifications constructed during the medieval period were designed to be multifunctional. Traditionally, the militaristic definition of a castle would have been its military capability, strategic position, and the strength of its defences. The castle would have been constructed as a private residence for a lord whose primary responsibility would have been to withstand a military attack for a long period of time from a hostile army. Consequently, these fortifications were generally placed in strategic positions to defend river crossings, transportation passes, or even administrative areas of importance. From a social perspective, castles would have acted as manorial centres for the local administration, fortified but not solely for military purposes. During the Norman conquest and consolidation of power, these castles would have been constructed near to former Anglo-Saxon manorial centres for deterrence and to maintain control of strategic sectors. The defining difference between a fortified manorial house and a castle can be deduced from the scale of construction. A fortified manorial house would have been much smaller in scale compared to the larger Norman wooden donjons, but they would have indicated some form of social status, but lower than compared to a motte and bailey. These smaller status buildings would have been clearly more domestic in function and appearance. However, they would have been of sturdy construction and capable of administrating local affairs and defence if necessary. There would have also been less fortified but higher status buildings referred to as palaces. These could change from grand buildings to smaller timber buildings, a label for a site that may not give the reliable indication to a formal functionality of that building. The discovery of foundations upon the site on which the castle now stands were uncovered during excavations conducted throughout the 1950s and indicate the presence of a pre-existing structure that dates before the Norman conquest of 1066 and was most likely founded by King Alfred the Great, a presumption which comes from his founding of the Abbey of Shaftesbury, a monastic organisation with which this castle was constantly connected throughout the early medieval era. Elfgefu, the daughter of Alfred, was ordained as the first abbess of Shaftesbury, and to her Alfred granted hereditary rights and privileges to the surrounding domain, with Corfe, then a fortified manorial centre, which may have acted as a local administration centre and hospitium for visiting pilgrims to Shaftesbury Abbey included. It may have also been the royal residence of King Edward, who was murdered at Corfe in 978. Due to the importance of Wareham, which during the Saxon period was a principal town and port of the Kingdom of Wessex against the Viking incursions, Corfe would have acted as one of the town's defensive structures, with a layout consisting of a basic wooden tower situated upon the hill. With the capture of Wareham Castle, the most fortified position in Wessex, by the Viking general Halfdan, King Alfred encouraged the further fortification of manor houses. This may have also included Corfe. With the Norman conquest of 1066 and the publication of the Domesday Book, a defensible structure located within the region of Corfe itself was recorded. However, the current consensus is that this entry was a mistake, and the Anglo-Saxon structure had at this point been demolished. Interestingly, Corfe's strategic importance was relatively minimal. The castle could be easily bypassed. The castle's real value was its control over the lucrative Purbeck marble quarries. William the Conqueror ordered the construction of a royal castle on the site of the former Anglo-Saxon manor house in order to maintain effective control of these quarries. Unusually for this period, the construction materials used were stone instead of the traditional wooden timber, which could possibly indicate its high status. The first stage of construction of the castle would have been during the 11th century, with the construction of the West Bailey Hall and a surrounding wall. This would have protected the inner ward. The construction of this defensive fortification following the Norman conquest was to aid the occupation and suppression of England. This was while William the Conqueror cemented his position as ruler of England. Due to the violent nature of Corfe's demolition by the parliamentarians at the end of the Civil War, followed by several centuries of exposure to the elements and neglect, the fact that so much of Corfe still survives shows us the extreme quality of the original construction and how this quality was maintained through further modification and construction projects. Due to the defensive requirements, Corfe was expected to ensure that high-quality materials were sourced for construction. These materials consisted of Purbeck stone, ashlar, and rubber with a flint core. Today the surviving elements of the castle include the curtain walls, which survive in part along with several of the semicircular defensive towers. The surviving walls consist of refined and rough ashlar, and some sections of surviving as rubble. The western gatehouse with two circular defence towers, a feature shared by both at the central and southern towers, has dropped by several feet, due to the undermining during the English Civil War. The segmental arch southern gatehouse is in remarkably intact condition, with a stone bridge over the drained moat. The central gatehouse with the segmental arch is still linked to the curtain wall. At the north-west of the site, the lower walls of the 11th century northern hall still survive, with some of the original herringbone masonry decipherable. To the west of the site, the Boutavant Tower, constructed during the 13th century, still remains. And at the centre of the site, the iconic keep still partially stands. This donjon, constructed during the 12th century, was originally a 3-storey building, with an extra 4th storey added during the 13th century. Positioned above the vaulted overcroft to the west of the keep was the 13th century hall house, a somewhat large structure which would have contained the Lord's solar. This room was much smaller than the Great Hall, and was purposely separated from the rest of the castle. This was in a similar fashion to the moat that separated the Anglo-Saxons from the Normans. This room was created for comfort, and would have served as the private retreat for the lord and his family. It would have also displayed status over the castle's other Norman occupants, who also maintained strict social barriers amongst themselves. In keeping with Norman tradition, the castle was separated from the Anglo-Saxon settlement by a deep ditch. This ditch served as a vital defensive purpose. It also maintained a cultural barrier from the native Anglo-Saxons. This social separation between cultures is shown by the typical layout of Norman castles, constructed in urban centres such as the Tower of London and Windsor Castle. A defensive structure designed to serve as an intimidating symbol of authority and power to the local populace, would also house the newly formed ruling elite. This would cement psychologically this new order of occupation and the reduced social status of the Anglo-Saxons. After the ascension of Stephen to the throne, it was clear that a period of civil war and unrest between himself and the supporters of Empress Matilda, the daughter of Stephen's predecessor King Henry I, was inevitable. It also became apparent to both sides that control over these strategic fortified centres of administration and still potent symbols of 60 years of Norman power and control was paramount to victory. King Stephen actively encouraged his supporters amongst the nobility and the clergy to further fortify their places of residence to ensure they did not fall into the hands of Matilda. This turned out to be one of Stephen's greatest oversights that would have future consequences for himself, his successors, and the country's political landscape. The fortification of the nobility's strongholds and the country's administrative centres empowered them with the ability to assert influence over the crown, which now had to contend with the threat of reprisal from a nobility that now operated vital force-controlling strategic locations. After several successful sieges against the castles, such as the ones in Wareham and De Vere's, Stephen was ultimately foiled in capturing the strategically significant Corfe. This was due to the strength of the defences. The rings of siege work associated with Stephen's unsuccessful siege of Corfe in 1139 is today located a short distance to the west of the castle and is scheduled as a separate monument. With the ending of hostilities in 1153 and a guarantee that Matilda's son Henry would become King Stephen's heir, a further condition was added to the peace treaty. This stipulated that all castles built after the reign of Henry I were to be demolished. Due to the symbolic nature of castles and its links to the House of Normandy, and the important part it played in determining the outcome of the Civil War, the demolition of Stephen's castles could be seen as an attempt to remove all physical traces of his reign from the landscape. Due to Corfe having been constructed several decades earlier, it was spared demolition. The reigns of Henry II and Richard I were periods of relative calm for Corfe, and there is little recorded activity. During the reign of King John I, an extensive building work was undertaken, with Corfe being adapted to serve several different administrative and civil functions: a treasury, royal palace, and prison. It is also believed that John may have housed the royal regalia within Corfe for a short period of time. During the extensive construction of castles that was carried out during the reign of Edward I, the defences of Corfe were further enhanced with the completion of the Outer Bailey defences. Apart from the repair work undertaken by Edward III, further modifications were not undertaken until the castle was converted into a stately home during the 16th century. The remains of this Tudor conversion by Sir Christopher Hatton can be identified by the surviving Tudor windows and fireplaces that still adorn the walls of the keep. With the ending of the English Civil War in 1646, a vote was passed in the Commons for the destruction of Corfe Castle. The castle had served as a prominent symbol of royalist resistance after withstanding several parliamentarian assaults, only to be taken through subterfuge in the closing months of the war. The resulting demolition charges scattered the castle's material on the slopes and surrounding valley. The ruins of the castle were then preserved as a romantic ruin that is now today maintained by the National Trust.